Thank you all for being here. Thank you, Senator Bennet, for having me. Thank you for your work on cannabis and many other things. Which
By the way, I should say Casey Gerald's book, There Are No Miracles Here, was a Michael Bennet book of the year in 2018, which is how we met. I read Casey's book in less than 2 days, and I called him up, and we've known each other ever since.
That's right. Thank you. He's bought more books than my family has. So that counts for,
That's true.
that counts for something. I wanted to start with you. My hope is a couple things. One, that we leave here better than we came, which most people who spend time with you attest to doing. But also that we try to get some sense of why you've thrown yourself into public life more generally and more specifically into this presidential race. So we'll touch some on the personal, the political, policy, and we'll end with you reading some poetry, hopefully, because you are the most well-read senator in the Congress, which is a low bar, but it counts for it counts for something. George Packer wrote of you in The Atlantic, his qualities in politics are unusual, even rare. He listens closely, and he talks like a human being who is trying to figure out what he thinks as he speaks. He reads Montesquieu, Douglas, Whitman, Baldwin, and Jill Lepore, and he writes well. In his book, The Land of Flickering Lights, he says of a Ted Cruz filibuster, his hypocrisy has a papier-mâché grandeur to it. His moderation has nothing to do with political cowardice or soft-headedness. He is passionate about education, equality, and self-government, and he's devoted his political career to turning around the decline of all three. One of the things you did to turn around that decline is give a speech on the Senate floor in January that opened with the lines to Madam President, whoever was presiding over the Senate that day, "I seldom rise on this floor to contradict somebody on the other side." And you spent the next 24 minutes screaming and flailing your arms and excoriating Ted Cruz. What pushed you over the edge? I mean, take us to that moment.
Well, first of all, when he started to talk again, after 24 minutes was over, he said that I had yelled at him, and I said, I don't think I did yell at you, but I'll go watch the tape. And in fact, I did yell at him. And my daughter, Caroline, who's now, she was a freshman in college when that thing happened, was watching it that night. I think I've told you this story. And she was in the dormitory with her friends, and she said, "Uh-oh, I've heard that voice before." and by the way, all of my daughters have mocked me ever since then, because every time an article shows up with the words mild-mannered in front of my name, they circle it and send it to give you a flavor of my parenting skills. But what led me to give that speech was that I had no intention of doing it. I was sitting on the floor, and Cruz started to talk about the fact that the Coast Guard wasn't getting paid. And he was blaming what he called the democratic shutdown, or the Democrat shutdown, for that. And there was so much in it that was hypocritical, because he was using the Coast Guard as a pawn, which no politician should do. He was lying about who was responsible for the shutdown, which everybody in America knew was Trump's shutdown. Trump was the one who said, "I am going to shut the government down for my wall." But he was out there just lying. I mean, and then for me, because he had been the guy who had shut the government down when Colorado had been flooded in 2013, literally closing it with green eggs and ham and all that stuff, while we were digging out from under the worst flood that we had had in a generation that killed people in my state and destroyed. To me, he just represented the tip of the spear of everything that's gone wrong in our politics over the last 10 years. And much of that is about hypocrisy. Much of that is about a political reaction to the election of Barack Obama that took the form of what I describe in the book as a tyranny of the minority, of the so-called Tea Party that metastasized into the Freedom Caucus, and who, together with Mitch McConnell, in my view, have completely immobilized our exercise in self-government. And and I basically, if you watch the speech, you don't have to read the book because everything that I'd written is in there. And people said, well, that seemed extemporaneous. It was totally extemporaneous,
Was it
except
really?
for the fact that I'd been writing this book for the 2 years before. Yeah.
Did you feel? I mean, I've given speeches for a long time, and so much of the deal is being aware of sort of how you feel in the moment. I mean, it's very rare to see a senator on the Senate floor that, I mean, unhinged is not the word,
No.
but I mean,
That's sort of the word.
but in a very powerful way. I mean,
Yeah.
unhinged for good, maybe you say.
Yeah, I mean, there wasn't. I think the reason for that is that it was completely spontaneous. I mean, I was sitting next to poor Doug Jones, who's got enough problems because he's a Democrat who represents Alabama.
That's right.
And he's sitting there, and we were going to lunch. That's where I was going to go. And then Cruz started to say what he was saying about the first responders. And I said to Doug, you better go on to lunch because I can't let this go.
Huh.
And then he sat there for 24 minutes. You could look at him wincing every now and then as I continued on with it. But I think, it's unusual to have more than one senator on the floor at the same time, much less to have a real debate. Usually somebody's down there just reading a speech into the record. So I think that's another reason why it interested people.
Yes, yes. And we'll get to some of the other things in it. I think the way the speech went viral actually touches on your critique of our public discourse because you had a great number of substantive points in the 24 minutes that wasn't just about you versus Ted Cruz, we'll get to. But it actually kind of highlights one of the things that we were somewhat disagreeing with backstage, which is in your book and in your public life, you basically make the case that the problem of the paralysis of our political moment is that the two sides can't come together and find common ground. But you outline in this book 5 huge historic examples of what boils down to Republican intransigence. So rather than saying what's wrong with the government, federal government, what's wrong with the Senate, why don't you say what's wrong with Republicans?
Well, I think that's a fair question. I guess I would describe it this way, having reflected on this and reflected on conversations I've had with you and others, is that I really do believe what I write in this book, which is that when the founders created this country and did it in obviously very imperfect ways, there was, among other founding principles, was the principle that we would disagree with each other, not that we would agree with each other. That was a founding idea. And they thought, as Enlightenment thinkers, that out of those disagreements, Casey believes this, you believe that, the other person believes this, that out of those disagreements for the people that they allowed to participate in the public square, which obviously wasn't a lot of people, that out of those disagreements we would burnish more imaginative and durable solutions than any king or tyrant could come up with on their own. And I actually believe that. I believe that's why our system is designed the way it's designed, and that's how it's supposed to work. And I know in my own life, the worst decisions I make are the ones I make by myself in my house, not contending with other people's points of view, not contending with other people's experiences or even a set of facts that may be different than mine. And I believe there's genius in that. And what I would say is that the tyranny of the Freedom Caucus has been, they believe they have a monopoly on wisdom, and in their effort to bring our exercise in self-government to its knees, which is why they've been sent there, they think, not fiscal stuff, not because they hate the health care bill, but because they want to destroy the federal government because they're acting out a Sarah Palin cartoon version of what the Founding Fathers were doing. I would say they are the cause of our misery. I would say on our side, actually, the critique should be more that we haven't been as good as they. We haven't won, and we have been feckless. When you look at the judges, when you look at climate, we haven't been as effective. And so what I've been saying on the campaign trail is, I would never want any of us to be as malevolent or as cynical as Mitch McConnell is ever. But I'd like us to be as strategic as Mitch McConnell is. And I'd like to stop losing to Mitch McConnell.
Yes, yes. We'll get to the core.
So that might be a little bit of an amendment to my book.
That's good. That's a revision.
Legislative.
That's right.
Legislative effort.
What do you get? Deliberative. That's good. So you start to understand why perhaps someone who is in public life, who was drafted to run a school system, who then was drafted to be a senator. You call yourself an accidental senator, but then you ran twice and won and represent a state that's a third Democrat, a third Republican, a third independent. And then you decide, after a life or death experience of your own personal health, after seeing a decade in the Senate, you decide to run for the highest office in the land, to run a federal government that has been disabled. Take us to that decision, not in the like Mitt Romney Netflix documentary way, but like, you know, what is that conversation like of an individual citizen deciding that they ought to run the country, which takes a lot of gumption, yeah?
It takes a lot of gumption and
courage also.
And well, and or you can be a sociopath. and then it makes it really easy. Really easy.
That's right.
I'm not talking about anybody who's actually in the race, but I just have thought that it would help to be one.
Sure.
I never thought I'd run for president. I was surprised enough to be in the Senate. But I spent 2 years working on this. I thought my diagnosis was true and accurate about what the corruption was we were facing, what we had to overcome. I came to believe, writing the book, that if we continue down this path for another 10 years, that my generation will be the first generation of Americans to leave less opportunity, not more, to the people that are coming after us. And I fell in love with our democracy again, the idea of our democracy. I mean, and that's the part of this where I think I am, somebody described me once as a pragmatic idealist, and I like that description, pragmatic, in the sense that I don't think it's worth being there unless you want to actually accomplish something. Idealistic in the sense that I think humanity needs this form of organization to be an available option or choice for us. And so I looked around and I didn't think there was anybody else who would make the same case, and I decided that, part of my responsibility as a citizen of this country was to step up and do whatever it is that I could do. I wouldn't have run if I didn't think that I could win. I may still be the only person in America that thinks I could win, but I do think I can win, and that's why I've stayed in the race.
There we go. Why do you think you can win, and what does it look like on a daily basis to try to convince other people of that?
The reason I think I can win is that I'm the only candidate in this race who has won 2 tough national races in a purple state, and I think that's critically important for us going forward. Winning the United States Senate cannot be an afterthought for the candidates that are running for president on the Democratic side. This has to be thought of as important as who is going to be in the White House for all the reasons that I point out in here. And so the policy agenda that we pursue, we need to ask ourselves, can we win in Colorado? Can we win in Iowa? Can we win in Arizona? Can we win in North Carolina? Do we have something to say to the red parts of this country that voted for Donald Trump, or the 9 million voters who voted twice for Barack Obama and once for Donald Trump? Because if we don't, we're not going to beat Donald Trump. And I'm irritated enough with the fact that we lost to him once. We should never have lost to him the last time. I think in part we did because we thought we never would lose to him. And if we do it again, shame on us. So I think I've got a perspective that is one that will work. And then what does it look like? It's weird because we've got, and I write a lot about the rise of social media here. I mean, we have basically 2 primaries going on. We got a social media primary going on. And you and I have talked about this before, and we have a living, breathing human being primary going on, who are people who live in Iowa, where the caucus is, New Hampshire and South Carolina, who are only now, this week, beginning to tune into this election, haven't made up their mind about anything except that they want to beat Donald Trump, and they want to evaluate each of us on that criterion, which I think is the right way for them to think about it, and who are not obsessed by politics, and believe it or not, are not spending 3 hours a night watching cable television. That's not what they're doing.
Yeah.
They are living their lives, and they're expecting that the people that are occupying the office that I'm in or running for president are going to run the government the way Schoolhouse Rock tells you you're supposed to run the government,
Yes.
how a bill becomes a law. And unfortunately, that's not what we're doing. If we did that, if we did what the Constitution says we should do and that little cartoon says we'd be fine, but we're not doing it. So what it's like is just, showing up and showing up and showing up, and it's obviously a huge privilege to have the chance to do it.
Last time we saw each other was in the hallway at 30 Rock. I was coming off of Morning Joe and you were going on. And I think everybody who does a news show, once you finish it, you say, why in the hell would I ever do something like that again? So how do you, you are known as an abnormally honest politician. That wasn't a joke, I was serious about that. Television does not always allow for nuance, nor do campaigns necessarily. How do you tell the truth and still be electable?
My oldest daughter, Caroline, when I was trying to decide whether to run for president, said to me, Dad, if you run and tell the truth and you lose, no one can fault you for running. And I said to her, Caroline, that's good, because if there's no other reason for me to run. There's literally no reason for me to run, and it's the only way I think I can win. And what I think it looks like in historical terms is John McCain's race when he was running the Straight Talk Express. It's not easy to do on TV, and I'm not as effective in some ways maybe as he was, but and I don't know in the end whether there's a market for it, but I actually think there is a market for it, because I think people are sick and tired of being lied to by politicians, and they're sick and tired of people overpromising stuff they can't deliver. They just want us to be able to take care of business back there, which we haven't been able to do for a really long time. And the going on TV is interesting too, because none of this, I'm not naturally an extroverted person. But it stretches you, and before I got kicked off the debate stage, I was on the debate stage twice, and you learn a lot being on
What do you learn?
10 people. Well, you learn, first of all, it's a bad way to run a political system and a government, but you learn what it's like to stand up there for 2 hours on national television, knowing that the camera can be on you at any second, and that you've got to find your 5 or 6 seconds or minutes to be able to make your point. That's not easy, and I congratulate the people that have done it well.
Is there anything that the debates, because we've had so many debates, whether it's healthcare, whatever, is there anything that the debates you feel have failed to address that is a core issue facing the next president?
Well, I think many things, but I'd put at the top of the list childhood poverty. There's been no discussion of that at all. There's been no discussion of the fact that our education system today is reinforcing the income inequality that we have as a country. There's been I would say the debates have been, I would say the only place where the debates have really created, I wouldn't even say have elucidated much, but have clarified the disagreement is on healthcare, because we've spent so much time on healthcare. And it's important because there are important disagreements about healthcare in the country, but it's not, it doesn't deserve to be the dominant issue every night. I think there's been too little on foreign policy as well. with the kind of stuff that's going on in the planet right now, we should be talking more about that.
I want to get to foreign policy in a bit, but I have one Trump question, and then we'll be done with Trump for the night. No, because I think everybody's sick of Trump.
I'm sick of it.
But you talk about the Twitter primary, and you say, you said in an interview, the Twitter base of the Democratic Party decides what's important, not the actual base. The actual base of the Democratic Party are a bunch of people that have never, ever, ever engaged with a politician on Twitter. One prominent member of the Twitter base of the Democratic Party tweeted last night, schedule impeachment proceedings for Bill Barr, Trump, and Brett Kavanaugh back to back, take them all on and demolish them, get every document by threat of arrest if necessary, then get in front of the people with your best communicators and make the case. That was a tweet directed at the U.S. Congress. What do you say to that? Because it might be the case that more people
I've been asked by somebody recently about the Lincoln quote about public sentiment, and about the need to have public sentiment with you. You can accomplish anything. I've said it more articulately than I just did. And I agree with that. I think my issue here is that we're confusing what people are saying who have the time to spend on Twitter engaging with politicians with what actual people need us to be thinking about. And I believe we need politicians who can withstand these Twitter storms that happen on a daily basis. Yes, as an elected official, do I think it's my responsibility to take input on Twitter? I do. Do I think it's my responsibility to take it on Facebook? I do. But as I say in the book, I doubt very much that we're going to build a better future for our children based on the discourse that's happening on Facebook. This is a language that is not only totally unlike any town hall that I've ever had in terms of its disrespectfulness, but it is a language and a discourse that was invaded by the Russians, who propagated our social media filled with racist diatribes of one kind or another that were indistinguishable from what was going on Facebook or on Twitter. So I think we should take it in, but I don't think it should define our policy positions or whether we're being strategic about what the next step on Kavanaugh is or the Supreme Court is. And I can assure you of this, Mitch McConnell is not paying attention to any of that. He's not paying attention to any of that. What he's paying attention to is what he's trying to accomplish, which is winning more judges on the bench that will support this, conservative agenda that, it's not even conservative, this radical agenda that Trump is leading us toward, and cutting taxes for rich people. And what the Freedom Caucus is doing is trying to disable our government. And what we're doing is losing our attention span every 5 seconds on whatever the next thing is. Twitter doesn't run itself by tweet. They have a board of governors that has a responsibility to think through what the objectives are of the company. And I doubt very much that there's going to be much left of this democracy if what we're doing is running it by social media. And I can assure you of this, none of the children that I used to work for in the Denver public schools and none of their parents are engaging in this stuff.
Sure.
What they're doing is working 2 and 3 jobs. They don't even come to my town halls. I was saying earlier today, if I could summarize the last 10 years of my town halls, it'd be easy to do. It is people coming to them and saying, Michael, we are working really hard, but we can't afford some combination of housing, healthcare, higher education, and early childhood education. And what I know about the parents who aren't coming to my town halls, because I know them well because of my work in the Denver public schools, and they're too busy to come because they would come if they did, and they would say, Michael, no matter how hard we work, we can't get our kids out of poverty. We can't get our kids an opportunity. And frankly, I think that's what this election should be about. If that's what we were focused on as a nation, there's no way we'd put a reality TV star in charge of this country.
Yeah. So your read on that tweet, aside from the form of it, is that impeachment is sort of a distraction from the actual only path to defeating Donald Trump, which is an election?
On Trump?
Yeah.
On the impeachment for Trump? I mean, look, I think he committed impeachable offenses. I think it's clear that he tried to obstruct justice, and it doesn't at all, offend me that people want to pursue it in the House of Representatives as long as they're bringing the public along with them. And you can't do that in a day. And to be, totally clear about it, we're 5 months away from the Iowa caucus, and we're, just over a year away from the election. And what I don't want us to do is anything inadvertent that causes Trump to be reelected here. I mean, you can have, I've had it, we've all had it, the philosophical debate about, what's a constitutional obligation, what's a political obligation, all that stuff. What I can tell you is we have a moral obligation to make Donald Trump a one-term president, and that's what we should be focused on.
Speaking of that focus, let's get to your nearer opponents in the Democratic primary. You write in your book about foreign policy, but it struck me as somewhat of a political question also. You were saying that we can hold evil in check. Sometimes this means accepting a lesser bad as a weapon against an infinitely greater harm. This is a legitimate tool of visionary statecraft. When I read that line, I thought immediately of why some people support Joe Biden. They say, yeah, he's a horrible candidate, but he's no Trump. So what is the case against Joe Biden?
I think the case against him is that we need a new generation of leadership in the White House, and I really mean it. I mean, you know, we've had this generation's been there long enough. Under this generation, we've had 40 years of no economic mobility for 90% of the American people. That's happened under Democratic and Republican presidents. And this generation gave us the Iraq War, which Joe Biden voted for, which I think is one of the fundamental reasons why people in America lost faith in our government. We don't remember that, but I remember it when I'm out there in Colorado, in Iowa, and South Carolina with families who had loved ones who were wounded or lost in that war. And I also think he's got a fundamental misapprehension of the way Washington works. When he says, if only we could get rid of Trump, it will all go back to normal. You know, I love the guy like everybody else, but what was normal for the last 6 years of the Obama administration, we couldn't get anything done in the Congress because the Freedom Caucus wouldn't let us get anything done because the Supreme Court had decided Citizens United, which has just absolutely created a, as I call it in here, a corruption of inaction in our Congress, the partisan gerrymandering, the stripping away of the civil rights, of the voting rights legislation by the Supreme Court. These are structural problems in our Fox News. These are structural problems in our democracy that we have to contend with. And I think it's obvious, at least it's obvious to me, that McConnell and the Freedom Caucus at this point have presented such a diabolical position that they actually can't be compromised with, that they have to be beaten or closed over if we're going to move the country forward. And that's my proposition is we got to create a constituency for change out in the country that can overcome a broken Washington. And that's really easy to say, and it's really hard to do, but I try to make the case in the book that none of the progress we've made as a democracy, as imperfect as it has been, and it has been very imperfect, has been easy. And when I think about the work from my perspective, this isn't the work of one election even. Like there's some people who say, well, maybe we should just elect Joe Biden for an election and then we'll be back to normal. And then this is a fight for the rest of my life, I think. And this is a fight to save our democracy. That's what's at risk. And if you don't understand those fundamental structural issues and you don't understand, I mean, we learned an important lesson. Barack Obama used to say, and I'm a huge admirer of his, but he used to say the fever was going to break after he was reelected president. And I can tell you this, the fever has not broken in Washington, and now it's, you know, 6 years after we thought that would happen.
Yes. So thinking about a path, say you eliminate Uncle Joe, say he's out of touch, you know, no good for us. I'm the choose me, not Uncle Joe. Then you still face, speaking about a fever and an illness, you still face two colleagues who feel that the illness is so bad we ought to amputate the whole leg or, you know, just kill the person. I don't know. Pete Buttigieg, who's a part of this new generation that you speak of, speaks his concerns about your colleagues, Senator Warren and Senator Sanders. He says, my concern about the vision from the Sanders-Warren approach is that it can polarize Americans when we have other ways to deliver bold solutions without dividing the American people further. Is that your case against the Sanders-Warren position? If not, where do you stand?
I actually think that's a pretty good case. I'll say that I think Elizabeth Warren, I believe, has run the best campaign of any candidate in the Democratic Party. I believe that. I think, you know, she's raised a lot of money and she's spending it well and she's doing a good job. I think there's a real question whether the policies she supported are ones that can succeed in the general election. And I think there's an overconfidence among, you know, some people in my party about the faith that they have in the federal government versus what the American people's view in it is. I mean, people in America don't want Bernie Sanders deciding what their health care policy is. They just don't. And they want to maintain the choice that they have. And when I say these things, I'm not repeating, Elizabeth would call these Republican talking points. These are Bernie's talking points. You know, Bernie is, unlike others, has been very honest about what's in his legislation. And I admire his, you know, his ideological commitment to the legislation. I understand where it comes from, and it's completely consistent with who he is. But you're not going to take private insurance away from 160 million Americans. You're not going to charge the middle class in this country a $33 trillion tax increase for the privilege of giving up their private insurance. It's just not going to happen. And the reason it matters is that we could actually lose to Trump. I mean, if you look at Medicare for All, if people know one thing about it, either the taxes or the insurance, it gets the votes of 30% of the American people. And you know, I was thinking about a conversation you and I had when we had dinner not that long ago about young people and their sort of perception of how everybody has failed them, everybody in my generation and politicians of my vintage. And a young woman recently came and said something that you had said to me, which is, look, maybe the idea is that you're supposed to start out here with an extreme position, because then you'll compromise somewhere where you, Bennet, are on the public option, for example. And I had two thoughts about it, which I talked to her about. One was that assumes a Washington where people are working in good faith to make a compromise. That's not the Washington that we have. Unfortunately, I regret that. I wish that it were, and I think it will only actually deliver for the American people when we get back to a place where it's doing that. But today it isn't doing that. And the other thing is, when you start out here, you lose. And if you lose, you have no seat at the table, and that's why I think it's very important how we make these choices on healthcare or on climate. And the choices that you make on healthcare and climate that agitate Twitter are not the same ones that can win you an election in Colorado. You know, we're very likely to pick up a Senate seat in Colorado. That's going to be hard to do if we nominate somebody in that state who's for Medicare for all, for instance.
You said in that speech, and it's true, that the Senate and the Congress had a 9% approval rating. You talk a lot about the loss of faith in government. One institution that people have a great deal of faith in is Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who sold out an arena in Arkansas not too long ago, a bit like Beyonce. Part of it is, I assume, love for the justice, but part of it I also assume is sort of an anxiety about what has happened on the Supreme Court, which does not even get to the fact that President Trump has not only appointed but confirmed 152 federal judges. I understand almost 70% of them are white men. Dozens of them do not publicly agree with Brown v. Board. I mean, you're in the Senate. Your job is to confirm or deny. I mean, where are you all on this?
He has, by the way, nominated out of those judges, he has nominated exactly 2 African-American women. And I know that because I actually voted against one the other day, which was very painful, because she wouldn't take the position that Brown versus Board of Education was settled law, which is the position that these folks are now taking. This is the crazy world we inhabit today. And it's, you know...
Here he comes.
Let me try to explain it to you.
Come on. You can get up and gesticulate.
So we're having a debate in the Democratic Party right now, which is an important debate for us to have, about whether or not we're going to go down this rat hole with Mitch McConnell or not, whether we're going to fight fire with fire, whether we're going to be as, you know, when he does what he does with Garland, are we going to do our version of that? And I've said already tonight, I think we should be as strategic as McConnell, but not as malevolent and not as cynical. Mitch McConnell can afford a government that doesn't work because he doesn't want to actually get anything done. That's a big difference from Democrats. So when I hear on the campaign trail, which I do every day, that we need to act urgently on climate change, and I totally agree with that, and if I didn't agree with it, my daughters would, you know, kill me for not agreeing with it. That's only part of the equation, because it's not enough for us to act urgently. We have to act in a way that endures. And in Mitch McConnell's Washington, you either get nothing done or you get something done for 2 years. And then the other side comes in and they rip it out. And then you put it in for 2 years. And the other side comes in and rip it. If you don't want to get anything done, that suits your purposes. If you actually want to solve climate, you can't do it 2 years at a time. It's impossible. So as inconvenient as it is to be on the side of actually trying to salvage our institutions, that's the reason why I'm for that. It's not just because I feel like we have a solemn obligation to pass it on to the next generation so they can govern themselves. It's also because I really do want to solve climate change. And I don't want to give up on the idea that in a democracy we can't solve it. That is a huge challenge for us. And the judges is a canary in the coal mine on this, because we went down this road of changing the rules and ending the filibuster, and the result of that is not only that Trump has twice as many judges, but that they're being put on the court with the barest majority, and they're people that would not have survived the vet in the old days. And they wouldn't survive the vet because Susan Collins would have said, there's no way I'm voting for that judge because the Democrats won't support them, and because they wrote a racist brief. And now today, it's in the currency that to get nominated, you have to be willing to say that you don't subscribe to the view that Brown versus Board of Education is settled law in this country. That would not have happened 10 years ago, and this is what I predicted would happen when we went to the 51 votes, is we would find ourselves in a place where the most extreme candidates for the courts would be the ones that would put their hand up. And the way they would show themselves as being extreme is, I would never have imagined this. I would have imagined on Roe versus Wade, never imagined there would be a badge of honor that you'd be willing to say that the Brown versus Board wasn't a precedent. And this is not, for me, about Democrats. This is about what we've done to the American people's courts. When I was in law school, which was not that long ago, and long after that it was also true, if you were qualified and you were up for an appellate job, you got 90 votes consistently. And every time we did that, we reasserted the independence of our judiciary. And we said, you know what? We're not going to infect it with the hopefully temporary partisan insanity of our legislative branch. That's all out the window. And I can tell you, people will come here and they'll tell you that it was inevitable. There was nothing inevitable about it. There's a chapter about it in the book. What there was a lack of leadership, including on my part, to preserve this for the next generation. And in all the mess of this, there's only one guy who's gone down there and actually apologized to the American people on the floor of the Senate for his role in this, and that's me.
Thank you for that. You paint a very scary picture of our democracy. So let's talk about China. In your, it's a great segue, it's so random actually. In your speech, you actually give more time to China than you do to Ted Cruz. I really encourage all of you all to listen to this. It really is one of the more important pieces of political oratory that I've seen in a long time. But you mentioned China landing a man on the far side of the moon, which we cannot do. You mentioned China's actions in Latin America. You mentioned China's GDP has quadrupled since '01, tripled since '03, doubled since '09. All this while not particularly being the most deliberative, at least democratically deliberative. I mean, does this give you some, how do you make a case for democracy when the most successful, by traditional terms, country on the planet is anything but, and the whole world seems to be moving from Europe to Latin America and beyond, away from democracy?
We're in and why should you care, too, I guess is a question, too. And on the first question, China is making the case, explicitly making the case in this world that they are organized in a way that will be successful for humanity and that we are not. And they are exporting their surveillance state all over the world. This Huawei stuff is totally non-trivial, and you need to worry about it and take it seriously, because what they're doing is using metadata about human beings to make their surveillance state stronger and stronger and exporting it. If you are a politician, and I was in Africa last year, or within the last 2 years, I've been to 8 African countries, and it's almost literally the case that if you are an elected official, you get elected, and then you go have your office party, or your election party, and then you go back to your office, there is a little ticket there allowing you to fly to Beijing to visit with the Chinese. We are nowhere to be seen, anywhere. And they're investing in infrastructure and ports all over the place. Why I care about this is that I think that humanity is meant to live in a free society, and I believe living in a totalitarian state is not where people are going to meet be able to fulfill their potential, no matter how imperfect we are. My grandparents and my mom were Polish Jews who survived the Holocaust, and they were, with an aunt, the only ones who did survive. Everybody else was killed. And my grandfather wouldn't leave Poland because he didn't want to leave their family behind. They were all killed. And then after the war was over, they lived in Warsaw for 2 years. They went to Stockholm for a year. They went to Mexico City for a year. They came here to this wonderful city, the only country in the world they thought they could rebuild their shattered lives, and they did. They rebuilt it, and they were deeply. You could tell always that there was some tragedy that lurked in the background, but their sheer unadulterated joy of being American citizens was palpable, and there was never an equivocation about it. Then they believed the country had given them something very special, and I think my grandparents gave the country something very special. I've never met people with a thicker accent than they had, and I've never met people that were more patriotic than they were. And I believe in all that stuff still. With all of our, because of all of our blemishes and failings and the stuff in the New York Times the last few, that you've written about and others have written about 1619, that's all part of the story. It's a story of worst impulses of humanity and best impulses of humanity. And I think for 230 years, it's been a dialectic of worst versus best, worst versus best. And in my view, Trump is an absolutely living, breathing manifestation of our worst impulses. But he's not all we are. We're something better than that. And what we need now in this moment, I think, is for our best impulses to overcome Trump. And what will do that is not chattering on the cable, but the hard political work of organizing people in difficult states to overcome, the election losses that we've had. It's the only way we're going to do it, and I think the only way we'll preserve the democracy. And as I say, I think humanity needs us to preserve it. There's no one else out there who can, as you say. Western Europe is under strain just the way we are, and they are looking to us for leadership because they know they can't supply it.
There is, that makes me think there's an election in Israel tomorrow. How do you square this circle of your president, January 2021? How do you square the circle of defending, which must be done, defending the state of Israel from all those who would seek to destroy it, while also defending democracy and human rights?
Well, so I've said on the floor of the Senate, and I said it because I believe it, I've said that, that I believe Israel's existence is essential to our humanity, and I believe that because of the history that I just was talking about. I also think it's fundamentally important for us to have a relationship with Israel where we can be critical of Israel and critical of Israel's leadership, and that's fundamentally important as well. And when I hear the Prime Minister say, as he did this week, that Donald Trump is the best friend Israel has ever had in the White House, somebody who has uttered the racist stuff that Trump has uttered, who has been the worst friend that an immigrant could ever have, who is rejecting our ability to take in refugees at a moment where there are more refugees in this globe than at any time since World War II. That's a circle I can't square, is how he could say such a person is the best friend that Israel ever had. There's something really wrong with that point of view in my judgment. And I guess the final thing I'd say about that relationship is we should be very cautious about we should be careful about understanding the domestic political imperatives that drive politicians to say certain things about the U.S.-Israel relationship and what's actually happening. And my view is, because of the road that the Prime Minister has taken, it's all the more important that this country stand up for a set of values and for a two-state solution that that respects the humans that are living in that part of the world.
Sticking with that part of the world, and we've got a few questions from the audience. You write about Iran and the Iran nuclear deal that President Obama pulled off, that then President Trump pulled out of. I had a somewhat selfish question, one, but I'd also love a more broader question. And the question here was, how would you as president deal with Iran's recent military provocations? In that, I'd love for you to give us a sense of why the United States gets to have 6,185 nuclear weapons and Iran gets none.
Well, I think because we're, among other reasons, because we have never said that Israel shouldn't have a right to exist. I think that's one good reason. They shouldn't have a nuclear weapon. And I would also say it's not just about recent provocations. You know, basically, if people are honest about it, what Iran has done is taken huge advantage of mistakes that we've made since we invaded Iraq the second time. We totally disturbed the balance of power and destroyed the balance of power in the region. And Iran has pretty successfully used that, filled that vacuum with an incredibly malevolent approach to the world from Yemen to southern Iraq to Syria and into Lebanon. And that is a huge risk to us, and it's a huge risk to Israel, which is why I think the president was so idiotic when he broke the Iran nuclear deal. I mean, that was, for once, an effort by the United States, an imperfect effort, but nevertheless an effort by the United States to manage a problem in the Middle East, not solve a problem, but to manage a problem without going to war with it. And by the time Trump showed up, what we knew from our intelligence agencies was that Iran was now more than a year away from breaking out with a nuclear weapon, instead of being 2 to 3 months, which is where they were when I voted for the nuclear deal, not knowing whether Iran would comply or not. Now we know Iran complied with the deal. This is a promise that I actually thought Trump would break, seriously. I thought this promise he would break, and it just goes to show you, you know, how little he understands about the world. And the fact that Bolton resigned because Trump was talking about taking sanctions off of Iran to try to get Iran to the negotiating table, right before this stuff happened with Saudi Arabia, tells you absolutely everything you know, or everything you need to know about whether Donald Trump should be Commander-in-Chief of the United States of America. He should never have been, and I hope that he won't be.
Yes. Switching back home, you talk about and this is to a question from the audience, but you talk about the qualifications to be president. Some people say, oh, time in the Senate is great. Some people say, oh, well, time as a governor is great. In some respects, some people have said your experience running a urban public school system is actually the best qualification to be president. So someone asks, in the post-Trump era, what can we do to really fix education? Are charter schools the start of the solution? I
think that charter schools can be a part of the solution. They certainly have been in Denver. Wouldn't say that every place in America should have charters. Iowa, for example, has no history of charters and doesn't have an interest in charters. And I wouldn't feel compelled to tell them that they need to do that. But from my vantage point, we don't have enough good schools. There are communities all over this city and all over America and all rural and urban parts of the country where there's literally no decent school for any kid to go, no matter how far they travel. You know this as well as anybody else does. And the solution to that is going to be transforming our education system for the 21st century. And by the way, I'm not sure the Democrats have an answer for that, because if you asked in a focus group, what does the Democratic Party stand for when it comes to education? I think what you'd hear people say today is free college, which is actually, first of all, a regressive strategy. But as a superintendent, I can assure you that free preschool would make a hell of a lot more of a difference for kids in this country than free college would. and making sure that the 70% of kids that graduate from high school in America but don't go to college can earn a living wage, not just the minimum wage when they graduate from high school. And we can do that. That's low-hanging fruit, is to make sure that people that are graduating can earn a living wage. And it would transform the lives of millions of Americans, and I think it would transform our economy. We also, I won't dwell on this because we won't have time tonight, but if we continue to stop paying teachers based on a model that was developed when we had a labor market that discriminated against women and said, you've got two professional choices, one's being a teacher and one's being a nurse, we're going to keep losing people from this profession in the first 5 years, and it's going to be really hard for us to make the change that we need to make.
Mm. You talk about making change. Some of the change, it seems that your colleagues have made have been, in some ways, to send us backwards. You write in this book, the 5 stories told in these pages are not ones parents would tell their children if they wanted them to be proud of America's federal government. One of the last stories it seems that you might tell if you wanted your kids to be proud is the passage of the Voting Rights Act, which seems to be, the gutting of which seems to be one reason we can't win elections. How do you, in the Senate, or should you be president, I mean, what is the plan to restore the Voting Rights Act?
That's a great point. So one of the pitches that I make in the book is that you're either for the democracy or you're not for the democracy. And if you're for the democracy, it should be easier for you to be for people, having the right to vote and making it easier for people to vote and understanding the barriers there are that confront people that want to vote. And I was in South Carolina not that long ago in this area. It's a terrible name. This is a name that you would have been mad about in your book. It's called the Corridor of Shame. It's called the Corridor of Shame because nobody's taken an AP test down there in a generation or two, and there are 15 high schools. And I was there with these 2 women in their 80s who had moved away but had recently moved back, whose families had been involved in the desegregation cases in the 60s or in the 50s, and their case actually was prior to Brown. It got swept up into Brown and became part of Brown. And they had come to this meeting because what they wanted me to know was, even though that their families and other families had had their houses burned down because of what they had done 70 years ago, and that their families had to move away for decades from this community because of what they had done, that the schools were worse today than they were when they were making this fight, and that the segregation was worse than it was when they were making this fight, and that the way the state legislature ignored African American children living in rural communities was as bad as it was when they were making this fight. And I said to them, what is your conclusion? What is your conclusion? And they said, we have to vote, and we have to vote out of office the people that are doing this to us. And I actually think that is a fundamental truth and premise of all of this, which is why what the Supreme Court has done to the Voting Rights Act is so disturbing. It's why what they did with Citizens United is so disturbing. I used to say that reading the majority opinion of Citizens United was like reading a 7th grader's American government paper, and then I concluded that was too insulting to America's 7th graders, so I don't say it anymore. But the fact that these people have no practical understanding of racism in America, of the effect of money in our politics, that they'd say that having billionaires be able to write unlimited checks isn't going to cause people to lose faith in our political system. And now we know from the polling that 95% of the American people think there's too much money in it, and the rich people have too much say. And I think, look, the last Gilded Age didn't end on its own. We're in a Gilded Age. It's not identical to the last one, but it has many traits that the last one had. And it took political action. And it wasn't who was at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, although Teddy Roosevelt made a difference. It was the American people saying, you know what, we've had it with this. We're going to change the Constitution so women have the right to vote. We've had it with this, so we're going to have direct election of senators instead of having senators bribe state legislatures and give themselves railroad rights of way, which is what was happening. We've had it with this, so we're going to build roads and bridges to have commerce. And you can't pass over that chapter in American history either without acknowledging the racist tinge of the progressive movement, which was real. But we need that again, and I think what we've got to do is, I mean, I believe we should, and this would energize the next generation of Americans, we should be working to pass a constitutional amendment to overturn Citizens United. We should be fighting for an agenda that overturns or replaces partisan gerrymandering with something else. There are all kinds of, and we should make it a lot easier for people to vote. I think we should have same-day voter registration. We should let people have 3 weeks to vote, make sure, and in many states, as you know, people are losing the right to vote because of Donald Trump's imagined notion that there's voter fraud out there, which there isn't. This has to be a big part of restoring our agenda.
Yes, yes. Two final questions. One, you mention often, and both related to two of your idols, Abraham Lincoln and Walt Whitman. You write about Lincoln's call for us to disenthrall ourselves, which comes from Lincoln's message to Congress before he wrote before he published the Emancipation Proclamation. And in that message to Congress, in which he said disenthrall ourselves, he also called for things like compensated emancipation, which sounds a hell of a lot like reparations. So I'll give you the question that your opponent or co-runner, Mr. Biden, who by the end of tonight you will have replaced in the polls in good faith. He answered this question so horribly, so we're going to give you a chance to answer it with great vigor and honor. What responsibility do you think Americans need to take to repair the legacy of slavery in our country?
I think that you can draw and I say this not as a politician, but as a school superintendent, which is a much more honorable profession than the one that I am in now. Believe me, you can draw a straight line from slavery through Jim Crow, through the redlining of our banking and our housing system, to the deep inequities that exist in our education system for especially for African American kids, and to the mass incarceration that's going on in this country. And that's why I support the reparations legislation in the House that would create a commission for us to look at this. We have never come face to face with this. It's a history that our children don't know. I was in the African American Museum in Washington 2 months ago and was struck by how familiar all the footage was and the film was. I was born in 1964, so I'm not claiming, unlike some people, that I was marching in 1968, but it was all happening around us, and we understood that the fight was going on. I'm not sure the next generation of Americans actually can see that fight, which is one of the points that I try to make in the book about how, imperfect everything is, but we couldn't have made progress without the unbelievable struggle that's come before us. So we will never come, I say here the legacy of slavery will be with us for our entire days. But one of the fundamental arguments I make in the book is that, the founders did two incredible things at the outset of the country's history. They led an armed insurrection against a colonial power that was successful. That had never happened before. They wrote a constitution that was ratified by the people who would live under it. That had never happened before. But they perpetrated human slavery, which is the worst thing that any human could do to another human. And it took other Americans, the example I use is Frederick Douglass, to free us from that shackle. And I quote at length the July 5th speech that he gave to the abolitionists. And just, I know we're out of time, but it's worth just mentioning this. Douglass, born an enslaved human in America, fled from Maryland and went to Massachusetts, where he found the abolitionists. And the abolitionists were making the argument that the Constitution was a pro-slavery document. That was their cause. And Douglass, who is totally self-taught, said, "You have this exactly wrong, exactly wrong. The Constitution is an anti-slavery document. We're just not living up to the words in the Constitution," which is exactly what King said the night before he was assassinated in Memphis, when he went down there for the garbage workers, when he said, I am here to make sure that America keeps the promise you wrote down on the page. And I think that actually is our fundamental job as Americans. And what I write in the book is that, in my view, Douglass is as much a founder as the people that wrote the Constitution. And that everybody in this room needs to think of yourself that way too. In other words, if you ask yourself, what is my obligation? What is my responsibility? What is the gift that I have living in a democratic republic? It is to be a founder. It is that elevated a sense of what your responsibility is. You can feel it, I think, when you say the word and when you think about it. And what I hope people will reflect on is how much harder it means we have to work, because nobody's asking us to do anything like what Douglass had to do. Nobody's asking us to do anything like what the women who got my daughters the right to vote had to do, or what those young men had to do when they climbed up those cliffs in Normandy. Nobody's asking any of us to do that stuff. What we're being asked to do is hard, but we should look at this as an opportunity to be able to fulfill a legacy of a bunch of Americans that have done their work imperfectly, but in a sense done it well, and we need to do our work well.
I actually think that's a fantastic place to stop. This book, The Land of Flickering Lights, is perhaps the most honest and literary political book we've seen in years. And it's a fantastically important document, and I thank you for it. Thank you all so much for being here. Senator Michael Bennet, let's give him one last hand. Thank you.
Thank you. This book, let me just say, this book, There Will Be No Miracles Here, by Casey Gerald, is not a book about somebody lifting themselves up from by their bootstraps, and a book about, look at me, here I am. It's a book about somebody struggle through American society, and the story that's told here is not first and foremost the story about Casey, but the story about so many other people in this country who never get the chance ever to sit on a stage like this, or have a discussion like this, or even, provide for their families because of the injustice that exists in this society. When I read this book, the reason I called Casey up is I said, this is like if somebody in my old school district in a school that I had closed, had grown up to write a book about America, and I think this should be required reading for everybody in America, and I hope you will read this before you read my book.
Thank you all.